Let's pray together. Psalm 28, verses 8 and 9. The Lord is the strength of his people. He is the saving refuge of his anointed. Oh, save your people and bless your heritage. Be their shepherd and carry them forever. Father, as we open your word this morning, we ask that you would do that you would be our shepherd. You are our shepherd, and we pray that through the preaching of your word, you would shepherd us, that you would work and tend us and care for us and correct us and make us like your Son. I pray, Father, as we study these scriptures, we would be absolutely staggered at the shepherd we have. We pray, God, that as we look here at Matthew 23, you would just show us what a refuge we have in you. And you would help us to fix our eyes on you and not on any man in this world we might be following, but on our one true God who carries us forever. Father, I can't do those things by myself, so we ask that by your Spirit you would work through the preaching of your word to mold your sheep, your flock, into the image of your beautiful Son. We pray that in his name. Amen. Well, God is in control of everything. He governs all things. God is sovereign. And a word we often use to talk about that is his providence. God has providence. He's in control of everything. But sometimes we say that certain things seem particularly providential. Something is providential. And when we say something's providential, we're not saying God's, normally not in control, but right now he is. When we say something's providential, we're saying maybe we can see his hand a little more clearly than normal. We have a sense. We can hope maybe identify a little bit of what he's doing here. Often his providence is a mystery, and sometimes something happens and we just say, God, I see your providence. This is providential. This is clearly your hand. And I'll just say at the beginning of our time this morning, I have personally that kind of sense about this passage we are going to be looking at today for our sermon this morning. Lord willing, at the end of our service today, I will be installed as an elder here at the Parkway Church. And as we've plodded our way for over 2 years through the Gospel of Matthew, this is the day, providentially, that we come to one of Jesus' most direct teachings about Christian leadership, about what it means to follow Jesus and lead others. So I will just say personally, I have a sense of the Lord's purposes behind this. But I also want to say this is not just a passage for me. This is not just a passage for those who are called leaders in the church. As I hope we will all see, this is a passage for all of us. So today we're in Matthew chapter 23. If you were with us for the past few weeks, Matthew chapter 22 featured a lot of conflict between Jesus and his opponents. So the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders, there's been this kind of rhetorical sparring, this back and forth between the two of them. And the chapter 22, the very last verse, ended with this statement. And no one was able to answer him a word. So they've had all this arguing, all this rhetorical sparring, and it ends up no one is able to answer Jesus a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So the result of chapter 22 is the Pharisees and the scribes have been silenced. They're done. Jesus, and they've gone back and forth, and they're out of questions. They've got nothing more to say, but as we will see throughout all of chapter 23, Jesus isn't done with them. In fact, all of chapter 23 is Jesus' rebuke of these religious leaders. He reserves his strongest condemnations for those who are leaders and are failed leaders, who abuse their authority. And in doing so, as we'll see here very clearly, he also teaches us what Christian leadership ought to look like. So our outline for today as we walk through these 12 verses is this. First, we're going to look at the temptations of leadership. Second, we will consider Jesus' exhortations for leaders. And third, we will look at one example of leadership. So temptations, exhortations, and an example. Let's start with the temptations. Verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you. But not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice." Now, the first thing I want you to notice before we really get into the meat of the text here is who Jesus is actually talking to. It spells it out very clearly for us. He's not talking to the scribes and Pharisees. He's talking to the crowds and to his disciples. He's speaking to those who follow him and those who might follow him. We could say disciples and potential disciples. That's the audience. That's who Jesus is addressing here, and that might seem a little bit weird. Because he was just talking with the scribes and Pharisees, and throughout the rest of chapter 23, he uses the second person pronoun, so he's saying you, scribes and Pharisees, so he's clearly going to go back to speaking to them, but here he turns away from these religious leaders and talks about them to the crowds and his disciples. Why might he be doing that? And I have at least two reasons. First, Jesus is just days away from the cross. We are in the last days of his earthly life, and on the other side of the cross is, of course, the resurrection, and then the ascension and the beginning of the Christian church. That's what's coming. We're days away from these things, and the leaders of the early church are here in this crowd Jesus is speaking to. And he needs to equip them to lead after he leaves. Yes, he will send his Spirit, who is the one we primarily need to lead in the church, but Jesus is giving them some direct counsel for the days ahead because there's a problem. The problem is the examples of leadership they've had have been horrendous. The Pharisees and scribes are the leaders that they've been learning from probably throughout their entire lives. That's their model for leadership. And so here, Jesus comes to them and he realizes we've got a problem. Because leadership is naturally something you imbibe from what you see. You will naturally be what you see someone else do. You will replicate whatever example is set for you. It's true in so many areas of life. It's true, I just experience it in my own parenting. My natural default innate parenting style is just my dad's. It's just what I was raised with. And I can grow and change and all these kind of things and learn, but my default, just everything being equal, I'm my dad. I can't help it. We learn by imitation as much as by instruction. And Jesus knows that. And his first goal isn't just to tell the Pharisees how awful they are. His first goal is to prepare his disciples for their own leadership. To prepare them for the days ahead when they will be leading his church. And with that, not just to prepare those who will lead, but to teach them, the crowds, everyone, what to expect and what to demand from those who lead them. Which brings us to the second reason. Jesus speaks to the crowds and his disciples here rather than the Pharisees and scribes because leadership is part of what it means to be a disciple. Leadership is part of what it means to be a disciple. Every disciple is a leader, and every disciple is being led in some capacity. Just think about the one another commands in the New Testament. Those are commands for Christians. For us in covenant with one another, we are called to encourage one another, to instruct one another, to admonish one another. Those are the kind of relationships we need to have among each other. And there's a kind of leadership to these things. You are leading and you are being led. A church is a spider web of these relationships. And sometimes those are more formal, official. Some of you here in this room are in recognized roles, whether you serve officially in the children's ministry or as a community group leader, or you're an elder or a deacon. But this passage isn't just for those with a title. This is a passage for every member of the church. Because all of you, if you are in Christ, have a responsibility, a duty to lead and guide one another. It might just be getting coffee with someone so you can ask them questions about how to be a godly husband or a godly wife, or how to parent your kids. Just asking them, and they're leading you. It might just look like finding someone who's hungry and wants to grow in their faith, and reading a book with them and pouring into them and sharing what you know. It can look like 100 different things, but leading and being led is just part of what it means to be a Christian, part of what it means to be part of a church, to be a disciple. And the Pharisees were leaders, but they were bad ones. Jesus says here, they sit on Moses' seat. In other words, the Pharisees and scribes, they speak to God's people with biblical authority. They open up the Old Testament and they interpret it and they explain it to the people, and they say, here's how you ought to live in response to the Bible. And Jesus is saying, do and observe whatever they tell you. If they're opening up the Bible and telling it to you, you should do that. You should listen up. The Pharisees were not primarily false teachers. Primarily, they were false examples. They were false examples. Their lives did not reflect the teaching on their lips. And Jesus identifies 3 ways that was true, but again, he's speaking here first to his disciples so that we might not imitate them. So that we might see the errors of the Pharisees, the temptations they succumb to, and we might lead in godliness, not like the Pharisees. So 3 different temptations, starting with the first one in verse 4. Jesus says, these Pharisees, these scribes, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. The first temptation we must beware in Christian leadership is eloquence without empathy. Eloquence without empathy, speaking to people but not striving with them. The Pharisees, Jesus says, have spent their time tying up heavy burdens. They're tying up heavy burdens, and notice there the focus is on the tying up, the presentation, how it looks. It's their preaching that he's talking about, their eloquence. They're good at their craft. They're gifted preachers. They can open the word and they can, spin a tale, and they can talk to people and be engaging, and they're tying up this thing that they don't actually realize is a heavy burden. It's almost like the image of putting a bow on a boulder. I mean, just look how nicely tied it is. But ignoring the fact that it is this heavy thing that the Pharisees and scribes are telling their people to carry, they are absolutely oblivious to the weight of their content, of what they're preaching. And worse, they think their job ends after preaching, and they don't lift a finger themselves to carry these burdens. In a word, they lack empathy. They lack empathy. Empathy comes from 2 Greek words, from the word en, which means in, and pathos, which means feeling. So it's an in feeling. It's a personal sense of what someone is experiencing. It's getting down into the trenches with them, of being with them in the trenches and fighting alongside them, bearing the same burden with them. And the Pharisees were too busy wrapping up the message of the Scriptures in this beautiful little presentation to take a minute and recognize that the very words they were preaching did not reflect their own lives, that they too must obey the word. This is a temptation every leader faces, especially if you are charged with applying God's word to someone else. There are weighty truths in the Scriptures. There are weighty truths. Jesus never denies that. There are truths that are hard to hear and hard to bear. I was just speaking this past week. I had a long discussion with several people who aren't Christians, and we were going back and forth about the biblical doctrine of hell. Because they were shocked and offended that I could possibly think that their sin was so offensive to God, was so serious that it demanded an eternal conscious torment. That's a heavy truth. Their rejection, their maybe frustration, anger at that makes a certain kind of sense. That's a heavy truth. And there are others in the Scriptures. Those wrestling with jealousy or with lust or with anger. The biblical calls to self-control and self-denial feel like a shackle on you. They're ultimately liberating, but when you hear you must deny yourself, that feels like a heavy burden to bear. Maybe it feels like you're being asked to give up more than most people are to follow Jesus. You're not, but it might feel like it, and it feels heavy. You feel the weight of biblical truths. We can go on, but there's just simply no denying. Sometimes the Bible's teaching feels heavy. There's a weight to it. And on the one hand, we shouldn't shrink back from preaching hard truths. We can't abdicate our duty because it feels too difficult or too unpopular. But on the other hand, a leader must never callously dump difficult doctrines on people that he's not willing to carry himself. We must feel the weight of what we're preaching, of what we're speaking to someone. There's nothing wrong with eloquence. Saying profound things in profound ways is just fine, but presenting the truth without personally submitting to it is deadly. In fact, James warns us. James 3, verse 1, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." There's a greater strictness if you stand up on a stage or if you sit across from someone and you're teaching them what the Bible says, because you need to realize you too must obey the words you're sharing. I'm regularly challenged by the words of R. Kent Hughes. He was a pastor in my hometown for almost 3 decades. A few years after he retired, he was asked, "What do you miss most about being a pastor?" And I think his answer is a great testimony to his own godliness and faithfulness. He says, what I miss most about being a pastor, I miss sitting down with a new text from the Bible every week and having my heart enlarged and life sanctified by its message. I miss having the text of the Bible go through me every single week. And I say that that's challenging for me personally, and I hope it is for you too, because it's so easy to just say something that's true and not listen to yourself. And just the fact that, him, after being a pastor for almost 30 years, says, I wish I missed so much having the Bible change my heart so I could share it with people. Because that's how it should be. And so often it's not how it is. Does the truth you speak to someone go through you first? Do you feel its weight in your own life? We have a duty to one another to disciple and to be disciples, but none of us gets to stand at the top of the trench and just shout down instructions. No, you have to get down in there. You have to carry the load yourself. That's not easy. I'll confess, in that conversation I had last week about the admittedly difficult doctrine of hell, I just personally, in that conversation, spent way too much time trying to win an argument, trying to make a rational case, and I spent far too little time feeling the weight of my sin and how my sin deserves hell, how my sin deserves judgment, but for the grace of Christ, that's what I would one day face. We can't focus all our time on just eloquence, on trying to make the best case, on trying to speak the clearest truth if we don't feel it in our own hearts. That's the first temptation, eloquence without empathy. Second temptation is reputation without reality. Reputation without reality. Verse 5. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for reputation without reality. And to do that, he zooms in on two details about the Pharisees that are probably a little bit foreign to us. Some of you might be familiar with these things, but I would imagine most of us, and we don't talk about phylacteries very often. So if you're not familiar, that's totally okay. So first he says, the Pharisees make their phylacteries broad. And what that comes from, what that is it's a little box with Bible verses in it that they would put on their foreheads. They would strap it around their heads and have it on their forehead. So if you, certain branches of modern Judaism still practice this today. If you want a visual aid, you have permission now to pull out your phone and Google it. No one's allowed to judge you for having your phone out in church. But you can go ahead and take a look at that. A phylactery is this little box with Bible verses on it on your forehead, and it comes from a literal interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 6, which says this: "These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes." Now, the idea of what that passage is saying is the truths of the Scriptures, the truths of the Bible should cover your life. From your heart to your head, your hands, you should just put things in your life so you're fixating on the truths of the Bible. But the Pharisees took that literally and they put boxes on their head, so it's a frontlet between their eyes. It's something that is literally, they can't look without seeing this box with the Scriptures in it. And then the fringes, or other translations here have it as tassels, are a pretty similar thing. Those come from Numbers chapter 15, and that says this: "It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes." So these fringes, these tassels, were just a little piece of clothing you would hang down from your shirt, and it was meant as a reminder of God's commands, much like the phylacteries. Today, this might be like, putting a Bible verse as the home screen on your phone. That's just to remind yourself of the Scriptures. And it's worth asking here, in light of Jesus' rebuke, are these things sinful? I mean, is it wrong to do these kind of things? Well, no. Absolutely not. I might have a different interpretation of Deuteronomy 6 than the Pharisees did, but the heart is not something to scoff at or ridicule. If you have a Bible verse in the background of your phone, that's great. I love that. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, when it comes to the fringes or the tassels, we know from the gospel accounts, Jesus himself wore those. Talks about the woman who reached out and touched the fringe of his garment. That's what this is referring to. It's the same thing. So Jesus wore them. It's not wrong to do these kind of things. The problem was that the Pharisees got the biggest, fattest phylacteries they could find to fit on their foreheads. They got the longest, fanciest tassels dragging behind them, I would imagine, like the train of a wedding dress. Just hey, man, look how big these tassels are. And the point was they were not doing it in the spirit of Deuteronomy 6 and Numbers 15. They were doing it not to remind themselves of the Scriptures. They were doing it so everyone else would see how humongously holy they were. Man, look at that phylactery. Look at these tassels. It's all a performance. They wanted the reputation for godliness, but they didn't bother with the reality. They only cared about the opinions of the people. And I think in that we see how easy it is to turn something good, something we should do, even obedience to a command, into a hypocritical performance. Jesus said, to paraphrase, back in Matthew 5, "Let others see your good works so that they might glorify God." So when you do good works, it's okay for people to see that. They'll glorify God. That's not wrong. Part of the point of Christian leadership is living your life before others so that by watching you, they can know what it looks like to follow Jesus. That's part of what it means. The difference is not whether or not you do some religious practice. The difference is the motivation in your heart. Are you doing it because you want the reality or because you just want the reputation? I had a pastor at a previous church who always wrote 2 questions to himself at the top of his sermon notes. 2 questions he would read every Sunday he stood at the pulpit and preached. The questions were these: who do these people need? And who will I answer to? Who do they need? And who will I answer to? Now, obviously, the answer to both of those questions is Jesus. The church didn't need to be impressed with him. They didn't need to think he was a great speaker, or he was really smart, or he knew a lot of theology. That's not what they needed. They needed Jesus. They needed to be impressed with him. And he didn't need their approval. He didn't need to live for that he's going to give an account to them. He's going to give an account to the Lord, Hebrews 13. And so he needed to remember he will answer to Jesus. But he wrote those questions at the top of his notes because he knew the temptation of his own heart. And it's a temptation we all feel, to be seen by others without thinking about what God sees. So let me ask you, brothers and sisters, do you want the reality or just the reputation? When you speak the truth to someone, is your focus on whether or not they think you're really smart and profound with what you're saying? Or do you want them to be impressed with how much you know? When you parent your kids at the playground, whose gaze are you thinking about? It's just the parents sitting around watching and see how he handles this one. Whose opinions are you concerned with? When you prepare to lead a Bible study, or when you meet with someone who's discipling you, are you trying to prove yourself to them? Whose opinion are you living for? There's nothing wrong with Instagramming your quiet time, but Jesus doesn't need an Instagram post to know what you're up to. See, even when we're doing the right thing, we have this fear that someone might not see, and we start to believe that the real value is in that thing being seen, and that as if our godliness doesn't exist unless someone knows about it. The truth is, even if no one sees the good you do, God does. It's infinitely more valuable to have godliness itself than to be known for godliness. God's view, God's knowledge is what matters. Because ultimately, earthly obscurity does not mean eternal insignificance. Just because no one saw doesn't mean God didn't. In fact, one day we'll get to heaven and Jesus will introduce us to some of his most faithful servants, and I suspect that many of them will not be the big name, well-known, well-published, big stage leaders. Most of them will be the humble, quiet, unheralded, faithful servants who had the reality of godliness, even if they weren't known for it, even if they didn't have a big reputation. And that brings us to the third temptation. verses 6 and 7. These Pharisees, they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. Now, this third temptation is the temptation to love the honor of authority, but not its obligations. To love the honor of authority, but not its obligations. The Pharisees were given privileges in honor of their status, their leadership. They got to sit in the center during meal times where everyone sees you. It's a privileged place. They got the best seat in the synagogues because they're the synagogue people. They're the leaders, right? They're a big deal. So they get the best seats. They get called rabbi, which means teacher. And everyone wants to be called teacher. That's an encouraging thing. And actually, more than that, in the first century, it was customary for someone of lower social status to greet someone of higher social status. So if you were of higher social status and you saw someone of lower social status, you didn't greet them, they were supposed to greet you. So to be greeted, to be called, someone, hey, rabbi, is a sign of your office. It's an honor. It means people realize, they recognize you have this authority, this leadership role. It is an acknowledgement of your prestige. And as with everything we've seen so far in this passage, that's also not wrong. Leaders, whether formal or informal, are due a certain honor. Whether or not you should greet people of lower status, that's a first century thing I'm not specifically talking about. I'm just saying leaders are due an honor. In fact, in the New Testament, it is commanded. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Paul writes to the church, he says, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work." In other words, very clearly, there is an honor due to those in authority. But the Pharisees are in love with the honor, and we don't get a word about the obligations they're meant to have. You almost get the sense that they're going to parties all the time because they get the best seats. You get the sense, you can almost imagine them, walking around the marketplace just waiting for someone to greet them so they can get that rush of pleasure. Man, I'm higher than that guy. I feel good. There is indeed an honor to leadership. For others to listen to you and to look to you and to follow you is an awesome privilege. But the privileges are always downstream from the responsibilities. The privileges are downstream from the responsibilities. 1 Timothy 5 says, "Let the elders who rule well be worthy of double honor." Implied, if they don't rule well, they're not worthy of it. The duties of leadership must always come before its privileges. Those are the temptations that Jesus knows his disciples will face as they step into leadership. Eloquence without empathy, a reputation without the reality, and the error of enjoying the honors of the office at the expense of its obligations. That's not all Jesus has to say here about Christian leadership. Sorry, my mic's falling off my head. There it is. He has more to say. He doesn't just put up roadblocks for us here. He also charts the path. Notice here, verse 8. But you. He looks them in the eye and he tells them, here's how it's going to work for you, my disciples. He's not here just to, pound the Pharisee punching bag and get a fist bump from his buddies about how awesome that was. He's here to tell his disciples how they must lead. We're going to pull, again, 3 exhortations out of this. It'll be a little shorter than the temptations, but look at verses 8 through 10. "But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ." Jesus here there's kind of three exhortations interwoven, interlayered throughout these three verses. And exhortation for Christian leaders, number one, very simply, stop focusing on titles. Stop focusing on titles. He says it three times. You are not to be called rabbi. Call no man your father. Neither be called instructors. So this just flows from that last temptation we saw, this temptation to love the honors, the privileges of the office. There's a poison leaders are tempted to drink, and that poison is a fixation on title, on what you are called. Jesus says, not for you, not for my followers. My followers, that's not what you're focusing on. And to make that point, he does use some hyperbole. So he literally tells them to just do away with titles altogether. He says, no rabbis, no instructors. He even says, call no man your father. What do we do with that? Well, that's how we know he's speaking in hyperbole here, because Jesus himself has already said at least twice in the Gospel of Matthew, honor your father and mother. So Jesus isn't against using the titles father or rabbi or instructor. We see those, and that's fine. His point is not titles are bad, get rid of titles. Some have taken that as a reading of this passage. Certain denominations have, we have no pastors, we have no elders, we have no deacons. Everyone's just the same. And I don't know what they do on Sunday mornings, but that's an interpretation some people have had. But the reality is you will and you should have spiritual fathers in the faith. You will and should teach others biblical truths. But the poison, the danger is fixating on the title, what they call you, as if that's what ultimately matters. Titles are supposed to be descriptive, not prescriptive. They're supposed to say, here's what you're doing, and we're just going to give you the title for it anyway. They're not something, oh, you got this title, now you get to do this special privilege. No, they are something that ought to be a recognition, not a prescription. And sadly, the Christian church has repeatedly failed to obey this command. Many pastors throughout history have worried about what special little moniker they get to be called. Their churches have split over these kind of things. Probably the most glaring violation is found in the Roman Catholic Church. It's actually written into their hierarchy itself. So their leader, the leader of the entire Roman Catholic Church, is the Pope. Pope means papa or father. It's written into the actual title we've given, which seems about as close to a direct disregard of this command as I can imagine. But the community of the gospel is not one where we should worry about who gets called what. It's not a competition. Which brings us to the next exhortation. Number 2, live in equality with one another. Live in equality with one another. Why? Because Jesus says, you are all brothers. You are all brothers. One of the things about growing up north, I'm from Chicago, is I got to play a lot of winter sports that maybe some of you Texans missed out on. One of my favorites, is a game called broomball. Has anyone ever heard of or played broomball? Okay, yeah, some of you are from the north, so that doesn't count. But broomball is a game, a lot like hockey. You play on ice. But instead of a puck, you have this little mini soccer ball. Instead of a hockey stick, you have this, I don't know why they call it broomball, it's just this hard rubber stick you whack the ball with to try to hit it in the goal. And the fun part is, it's on ice, like hockey, but rather than skates, you just wear your gym shoes. And I always refer to it as the great equalizer, because no one looks athletic playing broomball. It is hilarious. I mean, I've played with college athletes, and I'm like, oh man, we'll see how this goes. And no one looks good when you're like lining up a shot and you like swing and whiff and fall in a heap, or you're like trying to run this way, but the ice is just, the momentum's carrying you and you're still going the wrong direction. No one looks like they know what they're doing. Broomball is the great equalizer. Everyone is on the same playing field. And similarly, when you step into a Christian church, into the community of the gospel, you step into a fundamental equality with everyone around you. No matter who happens to be a leader, no matter who happens to stand on a stage, there is an underlying similarity between every member of Christ's church, from the child who just put their faith in Jesus yesterday to the senior saint who's been walking with him for decades. There's an equality because we are all creatures made by our Creator. There's an equality because we are all sinners deserving judgment. And in the gospel, we are all equal as those redeemed by sheer grace. None of us belong here. None of us deserve to be part of the family of God. No one says, well, you barely got in, but I was a shoo-in. No. None of us belong, and yet here we are. In modern-day Bethlehem, in the West Bank, the Church of the Nativity marks the supposed birthplace of Jesus. We're not quite sure where it is, but it's a guess. And it's one of the oldest church buildings in the world. And if you ever get to visit the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, you'll find that to enter, you have to go through a door that's about 2 feet wide and only 4 feet tall. It's called the Door of Humility. And the message is that to enter here, to come among the people of God, you must stoop and come low. Because no beggar asking for bread struts around with their chest out and their back straight. They come low because they're weak and in need. And the reality among us is the same. You too must stoop and come low. We're beggars asking for bread. We are the sick coming to the hospital. We are all equal in our need and dependence on God's grace. By the way, that's the hang up with the building. I told them the doors were too big and we needed to make them smaller so we could squeeze people through there. That's what's taking so long. But that is the message of the gospel. We are all brothers and sisters. Some may preach. Some may lead Bible studies. Some may have titles, but all stand as equals in Christ. Which brings us to our third exhortation, the most important one. Remember who is supreme. Remember who is supreme. When you're leading anyone in any capacity, remember who is supreme. Jesus makes this point again 3 times. You have one teacher. You have one father. You have one instructor, and it's not me. It's not Jared or anyone else. It is the Christ. That's why Peter calls pastors under shepherds. There's only one capital S shepherd. There's only one teacher. There's one father. And this is why titles don't really matter that much. And this is why we're all equal. The comparison game that the Pharisees played is just silly. It's just silly when you put God in the picture. It's like us walking around, who's got the brightest candle, and we're standing in the sun. Who cares? Look at the sun. Who cares what people think? Who cares what they call you? God stands over all. He is the teacher, the instructor, the father. And the best news is, if you're in Christ, he's your father. He's your father. He has adopted you and welcomed you into his arms and made you his own. And then he gives you the privilege of serving him in whatever capacity he deems best. So elder, deacon, children's teacher, faithful friend, coffee buddy, whatever, who cares? You get to serve him. Those are Jesus' exhortations as his people anticipate his departure and as we, 2,000 years later, stand here. Those are his commands for leadership in his church. So stop worrying about titles, live in equality, you're a family, but most of all, remember who is supreme. But if Jesus just gave us those commands by themselves, if he stopped there, we'd still have a problem. Because at the beginning, I said, we learn by imitation as much as by instruction. You will be what you see, and These followers and us, we have all kinds of horrible examples. Bad leaders that we might be tempted to follow their example, to replicate. And these last two verses solve that, and more importantly, they remind us that we don't just have a good example. We don't just have a good model to follow. We have something far, far better. Verse 11, the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Now there, at just face value, very simply, Jesus is concluding by saying humility is the chief virtue of godly leadership. And that's true, and we've seen that throughout everything so far. But he's also doing more than that. He's doing more than that. Notice what he says here, the greatest among you shall be your servant. The greatest. In other words, there's one who will do something for all, for you. There's one. There's the greatest. And he's not just speaking generically. He's asking us to consider who the greatest might be, and we don't have to look far because it's him. It's the Christ. Jesus is not calling us to walk a path he's not going to walk. He's not calling us like the Pharisees did to carry a burden he's unwilling to lift. He is supreme. He deserves every honor, every praise, every title of all eternity. And yet this Jesus, our leader, humbled himself and became our servant. The Pharisees tied up heavy burdens and they dumped them on the backs of their people, but Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light. Why? Because he bore your burden on the cross. He paid for your sins. The Pharisees craved reputation and praise, but Jesus, who deserves all praise, embraced scoffing and abuse for us. Why? Not because he loved the honors of his office, but for the joy set before him. His delight was in the work he got to do and what it would mean for us. He came down to be lifted up to die in our place. Pharisees succumb to those temptations because they're easy. The temptation is always the easier path, but Jesus didn't do what was easy. And it gets better because he's not just our model. He's not just oh, wow, that's what we ought to do. That's beautiful and glorious and great. That would be good, but it's still not enough because we have sinful hearts. We have hearts that are in rebellion, that can't do what we even want to do. A good example isn't enough, but the good news is Jesus actually accomplished something on the cross. He didn't just show us what to do. He made something happen. He forgave us of our sins. And he began the work of restoring us to be like him. He sends his Spirit for all those who believe in him to live in us, to make us right again. As I've gone through the elder process over the last, many months, and I've approached today my installment, Lord willing, as an elder, I've just been struck by how ridiculous this is. I have no right to be here. How did that selfish, proud fool, in love with himself, how did he stumble up on a stage and open the Bible for people? How would he become a leader in Christ's church? I'm still far from where I want to be. I don't mean to say that's not the case. But somehow, by God's grace, I'm not where I was. Because that fool fell in love with Jesus. And Jesus has been making me new for 16 years. He didn't leave me as he found me. He put his Spirit in my heart. He brought godly leaders into my life who discipled me and just poured into me. And he brought me to this wonderful church. And as I take the responsibilities of eldership here at Parkway, I just ask you, church, to hold me to the standard that Jesus gives us here in this passage. Don't let me speak the truth to you without suffering and striving alongside you. Don't let me care more about your approval than our Lord's. And don't let me forget we're united as brothers and sisters. Who cares what the titles are? We're united as brothers and sisters under one Father who has adopted us and made us his own. Jesus promises that those who live in humble recognition of his supremacy will be exalted, but it is clear here that day is not yet. That day is not yet. So brothers and sisters, wherever you're leading, whatever capacity God has you pouring into someone or being poured into, never forget who you're following. If you walk this path of death and humility with Christ, you will find life and exaltation in him. Let me close just a brief story of someone who lived that humility and who now knows that exaltation. I had a professor in seminary who wrote a book, a memoir about his dad. His dad had been a pastor, but he wasn't someone you'd ever would have heard of. He never had a big church. He never had a best-selling book. His son, my professor, became fairly well known, but he wasn't. He just pastored a small little church up in Canada for decades, Sunday after Sunday, year after year, and then he died. And the book ends like this. When he died, there were no crowds outside the hospital, no comments in the papers, no attention paid. But on the other side, the trumpets sounded. Dad won entrance to the only throne room that matters, and he heard the voice say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord." Parkway Church, may we all look ahead to the day when we will hear those words, and may we live and lead like our King who has served us. Let's pray. Father, you give good gifts. You give good gifts. And we're thankful for the gift that this passage is, as all of us in this room must one day stand before you and give an account. And part of that account, Father, will be our faithfulness in leading and in being led, in discipling others and in being disciples ourselves. And we pray that we would live with that day in mind, that we wouldn't get caught up in all the little things around us, all the comparison games, all the who gets called what, all these silly things we do when we keep our eyes fixed on this earth. We pray, God, instead we would fix our eyes on you and on the day we will stand before you. And from that recognition, we pray, we would just joyfully, humbly, faithfully serve and lead one another. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.